Before we go into the public lecture, I'll make a couple of announcements about forthcoming events at NMML and the recent publications in the occasional paper series. On 4th of November, that is Monday, we have Dr. Soumyabrata Chowdhury from Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, speaking in this room at 3 o'clock. The title of the talk is Refusing the Feminine Position During the French Revolution and Not Telling the Story of Terouin de Méricourt, a feminist historical critique of medical sovereignty. On Tuesday at 3 p.m., in the common room in the Annex building, there is a weekly seminar by Dr. Ranjita Datta of Jamia Millia Islamia. The title is Saints and Sinners, the Sri Vaishnava Community and Networks of Control in the Early Modern Tamil Region. Then, next Friday, that's 8th of November, we have Professor Aloka Parashar Sen of the University of Hyderabad giving a public lecture in the Rethinking History series entitled The Fragment in History, Text, Object and Local History in Early India. And on the 11th of November, there is a memorial lecture in the auditorium in association with Indian Council for Cultural Relations. Sri Gopal Krishna Gandhi will be speaking on, will be giving the Maulana Azad Memorial Lecture. That is on Monday, 11th of November at 5 p.m. in the auditorium. Now, the Occasional Papers series has come out with a few more publications. In the History and Society series, we have two new occasional papers. Kathleen Morrison's The Human Face of the Land, Why the Past Matters for India's Environmental Future, and Geeta Tharampal Frick's Interrogating the Historical Discourse on Caste and Race in India. In another series, at Perspectives on Indian Development, we have Nithya V. Raman's Lessons on the Past for Revitalizing Planning Practice in India, Brinda Patare's Business Archives, A Window into the Corporate Past, and Kalyani Devaki Menon's Prayer and Power in the Sangh Parivar. Now, these papers will be available in PDF on the website of Nehru Memorial, but they are also available in hard copy if you would like to buy a copy for a nominal price just outside the seminar room. So these are just by way of announcements, and it's a great pleasure to have Rustom here, Professor Rustom Bharucha, who is the Professor of Performance Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. In fact, ever since Rustom moved to New Delhi, we were eagerly looking forward to his visiting here, and it's wonderful to have him as part of the Rethinking History series. Rustom's work is very, very well known, so I do not presume to introduce him. Many of us have read and studied and taught books like Theatre in the World or In the Name of the Secular, or more recently Rajasthan, An Oral History, or Another Asia, which deserves much better discussion in the current preoccupations with cosmopolitanism and rethinking of regionalism and nationalism. So Rustom's work always has opened up new areas for intellectual historical consideration, and I understand that he has just completed a book called Terror and Performance. So we are eagerly waiting for that. Today Rustom will speak on Between History and Performance, Reflections on the Limits of Disciplines. Rustom.
Thank you. You know, I'm a theatre person, and I feel there's nothing worse in the theatre if you face empty seats. It is one of the worst things in the world for any person in the theatre. May I please request some people to come and fill up those seats so their bodies there. You know, it's for us in the theatre, if the theatre is empty, it's like death. But in art world, I always feel it doesn't make a difference. You know, you can be in an art gallery and there's nobody there and no problem. So, thank you, Uday. And I'd like to thank the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library for giving me this opportunity to reflect and think aloud, and that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be thinking aloud on some problems, questions, and enigmas that underlie the relationship between history and performance. Now, this is the first time that I'm making an intervention on history in a public forum, and I should assure you that I am duly intimidated, not only by the presence of many, many seasoned and committed historians, but because I know that history happens to be one of our most developed disciplines in Indian academia. In my own institution at JNU, of course, we have the Center for Historical Studies, which has this very impressive legacy, any number of luminaries. In contrast, the Theatre and Performance Studies Department at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, where I teach, is barely 10 years old, just 10. And with no apologies whatsoever, I would assert that our discipline is as yet emergent. Now, this is very strange and paradoxical because, the practice of theatre and performance has been around for centuries. And we're very lucky to be living in India where we actually have evidence of many of these performances. But the intellectual reflection, the academic reflection on theatre and performance is of very, very recent origin. Now, this compels me to make a more general point. Disciplines in academia have their own temporalities, indeed their own histories, which in my view should not be hierarchized. So instead of playing into the catch-up syndrome by emulating the dominant models of history in the social sciences, perhaps we in disciplines like theatre and performance studies, perhaps we need to ask ourselves, what kind of history do we need for performance? How do we go about writing it? And can we claim a history of our own? I may not be a professional historian, but it would be disingenuous to deny that I've engaged with the writing of history, though not in the field of theatre. That's interesting. One of my most widely circulated books, Rajasthan and Oral History, was, as many of you know, drawn out of conversations with Komal Kothari. No historian or academic, Komalda had a prodigious knowledge of living traditions and material practices of predominantly rural communities living in the desert with whom he had interacted over 50 years. That's quite a record. I'm often asked why I call my book an oral history. Well, it's oral because its process of communication was predominantly through the spoken word. But to what extent can it be called a history? Well, to be honest, I'm not sure what else I could have called it. Stories of Rajasthan? No. Komalda was no storyteller. It was very hard to get a story out of him. For instance, if he was addressing cattle fairs, he would, in one of his many intuitive leaps, bring up Heer Ranja. And I would think, good. Now we can focus on the narrative and the characters and the musical dimensions, but no. In the very next sentence, Komalda would get to the point and he'd say, Heer Ranja is about foot and mouth disease. And he would then proceed to elaborate in painstaking detail how desert communities, when faced with a cattle epidemic, do not resort to panic as we do in the modern world, when thousands of cattle are killed and burned alive during epidemics. Such is the savage civility that drives our fear of disease. In contrast, the desert communities stay put, along with their cattle, and wait for the epidemic to pass, resorting to any number of local quarantine practices, of which listening to Heer Ranja is one such practice. Now, from this concrete example, what is foregrounded is not the expressive dimensions of the text, but its functionality, its use value. What does Heer Ranja do in states of emergency? So it is in its actual doing, rather than in the expressive or interpretive dimensions of the text, that the performativity of Heer Ranja registers. If Komalda was no storyteller, he was no singer. I could not have called my book Songs from Rajasthan. In my entire 3-year interaction with him, he never once shared a song or elaborated on musicology. Not once. Now this is strange, given the fact that he is widely associated with the category of Rajasthani folk music. Now keep in mind that it was only in the late 1950s that Komalda came into contact with the Langas who were working as laborers in Jodhpur. And he first encountered the kamaicha, the stringed instrument played by the Manganias in 1960, a very precise date. So we're talking of a relatively recent history. Significantly, when Komalda brought up the kamaicha in our conversation, he would relate it to the Sevan grass growing area in the grazing ground for non-stable bound cattle, that grass which grows in the Bajra agricultural zone in areas with 3 to 4 inches of rainfall and which grows so high that camels can disappear as they walk through it. So it was geography, indigenous vegetation and animal life that resonated more for him in his reflections on music than the technicalities of musicology. Now let me pause here and raise a more general question in keeping with the theme of this series of lectures called Rethinking History. And let me ask you, can history be sung? Yes, if we accept that this history is also inextricably linked to legends, myths and stories such as the commemoration of Sati relating to Rani Bhatiyani in the Olak sung in her honor in numerous shrines. Yes, history can be sung, a certain kind of history. More precisely, history can be chanted, as in the panegyric verses of the Shubraj, performed by Langas and Manganiars in honor of their judgments. Now keep in mind that the musicians are also genealogists, who maintain the lineages of specific families for generations, both from upper caste and low caste groups. As Komalda once put it, without genealogy there can be no caste. However, a skeptical response could be, how can we trust such panegyric verses, which obviously glorify the heritage of specific families? Aren't they made up for purposes of flattery and boosting the ego of patrons? To this question I would ask, how can we trust inscriptions on which professional historians rely for the marking of important historical events? I remember asking Romala Thapar this question quite recently, and I said, have you ever doubted the veracity of inscriptions? And she said, yes, maybe once or twice, but basically we know how they work. There's a certain formula in them. There's a certain kind of set of rules and codes. There's a grammar. And I would say, like inscriptions, the Shubraj comes with a particular grammar and a set of rules and protocols. In both cases, I would argue that the intentionality underlying the valorization of a particular event or family tree or lineage is perhaps not that significantly different. What is different, however, is that while professional historians have learned to read inscriptions with due skepticism and rigor, we, in the performing arts, have yet to figure out how to read the performative dimensions of the Shubraj. So what is the relationship of the grain of the voice, its pitch and velocity, to the actual shaping of a specific genealogy? We haven't been able to deal with this. So potentially, however, I do believe the Shubraj does provide rich evidence for the mapping of local histories. So even as history can be sung and chanted, the reality is that within the disciplinary regime of academia, history has to be written. No writing, no history. A very old axiom. Even orality has to be written in order to qualify as history, with all the protocols that one associates with coherence, selectivity, interpretation, which are some of the yardsticks put forward by Ronajit Guha in the writing of history. Inevitably, this history has to be written in prose, not poetry or fiction. That's another kind of dogma. If one presumes to sing, chant, or dance history, yes, indeed. Jalal Assad once suggested that ethnography can be danced. but he never developed that idea. And I know at this point in time of a theater group called the Los Angeles Poverty Department that works with homeless people in downtown Los Angeles, and they're doing a production at the moment called A Micro-History of Global Economics Danced. Now that sounds really interesting. They're dancing their history. But if we had to talk about this to professional historians, singing history, chanting history, dancing history, they wouldn't take you seriously. Therefore, even as it could be argued that what Komaldar was communicating to me was not exactly history, my attempt as a writer to assemble and sift the facts, deleting and strategizing all kinds of incoherences, counterpointing grassroots empirical observations with academic historiography by John Smith, Anne Gold, Dominic Silakan, Peter Manuel, I would say all of this did result in a certain kind of history which I needed to claim rather than disavow. And I claim it because I do believe there is more than one way of writing history. So keeping this premise in mind, it's worth recalling my first question to Komaldar, which opens the book. I said, you talk so much about Rajasthan, why don't you write? To this question, Komaldar said, I've tried. It doesn't work out. The more I know, the less I know. He was not being falsely modest. Instead, he was acknowledging very honestly how difficult it was for him to deal with dates and facts, and with the most basic principles of reliability, verification, accountability, cross-referencing, and so on. Milton Singer, for instance, once asked him, when did the Ravan Hatha come into being? Now, while Komaldar had his own theory as to how musical instruments capture entire epics, so the Ravan Hatha is the fiddle that is used in one version of Babuji Ki Par. We know that Dev Narayan is sung to the jantar. We know that folk epics in Alwar and Bharatpur are sung accompanied by the Jogya Sarangi, so that very specific relationships between instruments and epics. One could speculate that this Ravan Hatha was in use before Babuji was composed in the 14th century. However, when exactly it came into being would be very hard to say. This inability to answer precise questions relating to chronology and periodization compelled Komaldar to acknowledge, I'm afraid of history. And I'd like us to pause here and think of the fear of history. Today it would seem to me that we are living with an overconfident and somewhat complacent affirmation of the readily available expertise of history, which is increasingly archive-driven. Perhaps we are living with an excess of history, an oversaturation, which Ronajit Guha calls attention to, drawing on Nietzsche, who associated this consuming fever of history with the inability to forget. Well, our situation is a bit different. Call it an overcompensation for an earlier Orientalist and colonial derision that Indians don't have a sense of history. But it seems to me that what is on display today, at least in the academic world, is no longer any affinity to Nietzsche's history for life or history for struggle, but rather a capitulation to history as profession, with all the accompanying compulsions of careerism and getting a job. So against this phenomenon, I would say that the fear of history presents us with vulnerability and the stimulus to imagine other ways of writing history that are not driven by excess, but rather by inadequacy and fragmentation. Now let's return to Komaldar's acknowledgement, the more I know, the less I know, and let us think about knowledge. And more precisely, embodied knowledge. How does one write a history of this knowledge? That knowledge which is internalized in the memory of the body, as it were, operating like a habitus in Bourdieu's sense of the word, an inner motor, which enables one to do certain things unthinkingly, without verbal articulation or a written theory. In An Outline of a Theory of Practice, Bharucha says very memorably, it is because subjects do not, strictly speaking, know what they are doing, that what they do has more meaning than they know. I'm thinking of the knowledge that goes into digging a well, shaping a pot, or singing a song. It could be argued that there is a theory embedded in this practice-based knowledge. How does one write its history? There are some enigmas to be confronted here. From empirical observation, it becomes clear that there's a very delicate connection between embodied memory and the state of illiteracy, which is the condition for most folk performers. When a few Langas and Manganiyas learn how to read and write, few of them, it's important to point out that this very narrow understanding of literacy rules out other possibilities of acknowledging visual literacy or oral literacy. The reality is that literate folk musicians tend to lose their memories. More specifically, their memory is ruptured. It is not that they can no longer sing, but in order to sing, they have to rely on memory aids as we do. Now, how this affects the actual quality of their singing is a more subtle and difficult point to assess. In my view, it does affect it. Now, let's elaborate on this connection between memory and singing through the dynamics of improvisation. I'd like you to imagine a group of Kalbelia women from different villages sitting around. One of the women begins to sing a song, and you can make out from the puzzled expressions of the other women in the group, they've never heard that song before. And then a line or so later, some of the women begin to hum the song, just and then maybe a little later, the refrain of the song is muttered, the refrain which comes over and over again. Suddenly it's like an electric bulb. They all begin to sing the song in unison as if they have sung it all their lives. Now, how do we explain this? How can they sing a song that they don't know? And how is it possible to remember anything if one doesn't know it in the first place? Still more enigmatic. If these women had to be asked to sing the song again, they would do so. But the lines of the song would be shifted around. And once again, they would be singing the song together in unison without any overall supervision. So how does one begin to explain this phenomenon of collective improvisation? Does one turn to a notion of the collective unconscious, or to bits and pieces of tropes and epithets which are strung together like mnemonic beads, one trope triggering another? Do we stretch Bourdieu's reading of the habitus as a necessary and regulated improvisation which functions through conductorless orchestration? The reality is that we don't have any available theory to fully explain this enigma of embodied knowledge and creativity. And frankly, if you cannot explain this phenomenon, how the hell are you going to historicize it? The social sciences are not likely to help us in this regard. We may need to turn to psychobiology, neurosciences, and other theories of corporeality in relation to the infinitesimal functions of the brain. I don't know. I'd love to hear from you what we could do. So along with the elusive dynamics of memory, there is the larger problem of time. What is the time of oral history? At one point in our conversation, I remember Komalda saying, I don't think in time. I think in, and he went like this. He didn't complete the sentence. And how will we complete that sentence for him? Is he saying, I think in space? Perhaps not. In my interpretation, he's thinking through and in an interconnected web and assemblage of different contexts of knowledge and practice where time as such is not the issue. It's the practice, it's the doing that matters. Inevitably, this inability to think in time resulted in some real gaps in Komildar's understanding of the multiple temporalities of particular phenomena. For instance, in the 14th century phenomenon of Babuji, we have an allegedly 11th century phenomenon of Gogo Chauhan, the snake god, who marries Babuji's niece, and we also find Gorakhnath, who is the guru of one of Babuji's followers, and who has his own intricate genealogy. So how do these three figures coexist within the same narrative? By his own admission, Komildar was unable to answer this question, not least, I would say, because he didn't really have a theory of anachronism, which would have enabled him to do so. Perhaps there's a clue to be found here in the reflections of Giorgio Agamben in What is the Contemporary, where he makes the subtle observation that the contemporary is most meaningfully grasped through, quote, a relationship with time that adheres to it through a disjunction and an anachronism. Amazing. I think there's a clue here for Komildar's fundamental assumption that the folk is contemporary. It does not live in the past, even as it invokes the past. Rather, it inhabits its own space and time in the immediacies of the here and now, where it serves specific functions relating to everyday life. When the folk does get yoked to the past, when it does get frozen in the past, I think it becomes folklore. And I don't see Komildar as a folklorist. He's something else. So, what does all this have to do with performance? Let me narrow the question. How does performance enter the writing of oral history? That's the question. Drawing on my own experience in the theatre, I would say that the act of listening plays a critical role. Listening is not a passive reflex. You don't just listen with your ears. You listen with your body. Listening is an active energy that actually shapes the framework of any conversation. Even as it can operate at an almost non-verbal level, as a listener, I unconsciously played the role of the Hukario, the epic respondent, providing all the and grunts that accompany any epic performance. So it's a very visceral kind of action. And when I'm listening, I don't take notes. I listen. I take notes later. I would also say that listening shapes the content and duration of any conversation through an implicit intentionality, which prompts the speaker to share what he or she thinks is appropriate for a particular context and time. So I do believe in retrospect that Komildar was giving me what he thought that I was prepared to understand, which I had already in a sense implicitly prepared a framework for. So there was a kind of complicity between us which we never talked about. Now at a more technical level, I would say that the performativity of oral history is made possible through the insertion of any recording device. This insertion of a microphone or tape recorder is what makes it possible for the conversation to be played back, not once, but several times through ceaseless repetitions. My book went through 8 drafts. The writing of oral history is made possible only through several transcriptions and re-listenings. Ronajit Guha uses the word in the context of itihasa, of auditions. That's what itihasa is. It's the retelling of something that has already passed. And it's the re-listening of something that has already passed. And in the course of writing this oral history, I would say there are 2 principles of performance which are hugely important: repetition and reflexivity. Performance, as we know at an axiomatic level, never happens once, but at least twice, if not several times, in what has been theorized as restored behavior. Moreover, for any performance to exist, there has to be some kind of self-consciousness, if not double consciousness, which compels the performer to reflect on what has already been performed, either through an actual performance or in the social behavior of everyday life. There are other, more linguistically grounded readings of performativity, offered by Austin and Butler, who defines it as the power of discourse to produce what it names. And these performativity readings are more specifically linked to citation within a predominantly discursive framework. I'm not going to go into this here, but I'm going to concentrate instead for the rest of the lecture on performance in the more familiar context of theatre in the broadest sense of the word, where performance can be defined as a psychophysical embodied act made possible through an acquisition of skills derived from training and or rehearsal, which are shaped generally through a narrative for the gratification of a specific audience. Okay, so that's how we're going to define it. So now let's move outside oral history and think a little bit about theatre. What's the biggest challenge faced in writing any theatre history? I think it would have to be the intrinsic ephemerality of any performance. It's a truism to state in this regard that theatre dies in the process of its creation, leaving no trace of its psychophysical, corporeal presence. The visionary Antonin Artaud fetishized this condition when he said, "Theatre is the only place where the same gesture can never be repeated the same way twice." Needless to say, part of Artaud's predicament was that he knew only too painfully that theatre can never escape the tyranny of repetition. Nonetheless, under the spell of what we would say the disappearance of theatre, highlighted by performance theorists like Peggy Phelan, there has been an overly elegiac veneration for the loss of theatre and the state of mourning which it induces. And none of this, I think, has been very helpful for the writing of theatre history. If you're mourning all the time, you're bemoaning, oh my God, it's gone, how do you write history? Fortunately, many writers today in theatre and performance studies take a more robust view on the writing of history, particularly in the context of reenactments, and we could talk about that later. So even as the psychophysical dynamics of a performance may be set to die, theatre itself as an event continues to live in a diverse assemblage of mnemonic and discursive structures. In this sense, one could argue that theatre dies and does not die, not just surviving, but mutating in and through several afterlives. This condition compels one to counter Peter Brook's question when he says, "When the play ends, what remains?" And I would rephrase the question by asking, when the play ends, what begins? In a word, I would say that history begins, even as we don't quite know how to write or even to perceive this history as yet. What is the evidence of theatre? Very tough question, and I can't answer it immediately, so let me try to approach it by telling you a story. Many years ago, as many stories go, very much under the lure of queer theory, which is an unusual kind of beginning for a story, I began to fantasize the figure of Bal Gandharv, the legendary actor, singer, and female impersonator of Sangeet Natak from Maharashtra. Fantasy, I realize, can be considered anathema for most historians, but fantasy is the adrenaline of most theatre people. I don't think I was entirely fantasizing. I was actually drawing on some very tantalizing historical facts. Truth can be stranger than fiction. For example, Bal Gandharva's construction of femininity, his makeup, his refashioning of the sari, and the beauty contests that were held in his name in which both women and men participated. So even as the predominantly queer representation of Bal Gandharva got crystallized in my mind, I had the misfortune, or perhaps the incredibly good historical luck, to see a perfectly preserved full-length documentation of Bal Gandharva in a production of Sadhvi Mirabai. Now, whatever fantasy I might have generated around his figure was now systematically shattered as I confronted the very epitome of middle-class Maharashtrian propriety ensconced in perfect decorum and grace. So even as my fantasy was eliminated, there was one sequence in the film, spliced into the narrative, a few seconds actually, that I could not have fantasized. In the far corner of the stage, a conspicuously dark-complexioned dancing girl, as she was represented in the credits, and I say dark complexion because it was such a contrast to Bal Gandharva's overly fair, powdered, pudgy face. Well, this dancing girl entered the stage for a few seconds with extremely awkward movements, and seconds later, she was whisked away while Bal Gandharva entered from the opposite wing on a diagonal directly to the center stage, where he launched into a song. A more visceral impact of the violence of patriarchy in its authorization of female impersonation would be hard to imagine. Now, female impersonation doesn't always work this way. Female impersonation can be deeply moving, deeply uplifting, highly aesthetic. This was different. This was violent. This was brutal. So arguably, even as this documentation of Bal Gandharva censored my fantasy as a writer, it compelled me to rethink history in terms of the marginality and tokenistic inclusion of this anonymous dancing girl. Why was she there in the first place? And how would one begin to write her history within the exclusions of caste and gender in Indian theatre history? Significantly, I first shared this incident in a public forum in Pune, Bal Gandharva's city, many years ago, not in a theatre meeting, but at a conference devoted to the women's movement in India. And this is what I mean by the assemblage of discursive structures. You know, it's not just because you're working on theatre, you only deal with theatre. Theatre is filtering everywhere. And I still remember vividly one of the leading activists in this forum share how she and her colleagues had felt the need to start documentation centers around the women's movement in the 1970s. As activists fully immersed in the movement, they knew only too well what needed to be documented. But then they faced a problem. As the activist put it memorably, she said, "We realized that we had to create our evidence." I find that amazing. Create evidence, and I want to focus just on that. These words resonate for me today as I face the task of imagining new models of writing theatre history. Now, we know that evidence is not a given that already exists in the material world, which then has to be deciphered and interpreted. Evidence itself is constructed, as becomes only too clear in the strategies of dissimulation, erasure, and exaggeration to which lawyers resort in order to provide legal evidence, always according to the letter of the law. In a more complex register, we have the evidence of experience, as theorized powerfully by the historian Joan Scott, who in her readings of different marginal histories warns against any naturalization of first-hand experience or valorization of its innate authenticity. So instead of playing into the assumption that history is enriched through the insertion of new evidence from the perspective of the marginalized and the oppressed, Scott urges the rethinking of the writing of history itself. So in our context, what is one of the biggest exclusions in the writing of history? It's caste. Caste underlies everything that happens on stage. It determines all the roles, everything. Division of labor on stage is determined by caste. But it's okay, we tend to talk about it in traditional context. In modern context, caste gets invisibilized. So yes, there's a lot of wonderful work going on in terms of new cast-based performances. Sharmila Rege, sadly no more with us, was a pioneer in this regard. One respects her. But, it's not just enough to insert this. You have to actually rethink that frame of history itself. You have to shake that history itself. You can't just insert like you're putting sugar into a cup of tea or whatever. So in Jones-Scott's complex formulation, the evidence of experience is at once discursive and political in its construction. It is not something that happens and which we then need to recover and analyze in words. Rather, in her words, experience is at once always already an interpretation and something that needs to be interpreted. What is that something? And what is that and? I think this and is what stimulates the rewriting of theatre history against the grain of its existing historiography. So keeping in mind the need to create evidence, we may have no other choice but to elicit the role of the imagination in making theatre come alive, not in an illusory presence of being there, but in the interstice between an inadequately interpreted yet normative historiography and a performance whose reimagining pushes the limits of its historiography and complicates its narrative. Okay, now let me juxtapose this task of creating evidence against the protocols of writing academic history by calling attention to a classic essay in the field of Indian historical studies, which happens to focus on theatre, and most of you know this essay. Ronajit Guho's Pre-Subaltern Studies reading of Dinabandhu Mitra's Neel Darpan. As is well known, for perhaps some people may not know about the play, this landmark play on the Indigo Rebellion, written in the late 1850s, published anonymously in September 1860, resulting in some legal difficulties in 1861, was ultimately produced 12 years later in 1872 by the National Theatre in Calcutta in the first ticketed show of the Bengali professional theatre. This is history. By this time, Dinabandhu Mitra had received the Rai Bahadur, and the district magistrate honored the production with his presence. The British were always so liberal in terms of how much they could tolerate. In an unsparing critique, Guha focuses on the liberal humanitarian ethos of the play, which endorses the beneficence and what he calls sweet reasonableness of the colonial administration and its upholding of the law. So far from being a defiant subaltern play, Neel Darpan is nothing more than, quote, a loyalist play glorified as a manifesto of petty bourgeois radicalism. Even the so-called radical characters in the play speak in the voice of babus, convinced that malevolent indigo planters can be turned away from self-interest to philanthropy. And perhaps the most cutting remark comes from Bonkim, who compared his friend Dinabandhu's play to the Uncle Tom's Cabin from Bengal. I think that is the ultimate cut. Now, the sheer force and pertinence of this critique, which you all know, I think, are irrefutable. I accept it. And yet, I must risk acknowledging, against the grain of critical enlightenment, that it is unlikely that this is how Neel Darpan actually worked in performance. The problem is that Guho does not deal with the performance of Neel Darpan at all, assuming a conflation between the written dramatic text and its actual production on the stage. Now, this is one of the oldest and most tenacious problems faced by exponents of theatre and performance studies who have to constantly fight against the hegemony of literature. The idea that a text gets automatically transmitted on the stage and that it speaks itself is a total myth. Performance is not just a replica or reproduction or even an interpretation of the dramatic text. It has its own textuality, its own texturality, which cannot be separated from some of the key components of what constitutes performance in the first place: embodiment, corporeality, affect, breath, movement, gesture, expression, design, costume, makeup, and the specific performative circumstances of space and time that shape the event of any performance. Now, there's an ambiguity here, because the event of any performance is indeed linked to the historical moment. Definitely there is a relationship there, but it's not a univocal kind of relationship, and that's, I think, the key. Now, on these matters, most historians, elaborating on the multiple interpretations of specific dramatic texts, ranging from Ronajit Guha on Neil Dorpon, or Partho Chatterjee on Shirajuddaulah, or Romila Thapar on Shakuntala, are silent. Now let's pause here and reflect once again at a more general level on the multivalent relationships between text and performance. Can we get some air conditioning to work here? It's just a little hot. You know, I'm going to take you back in time again. You know why? Because I think the contemporary is more easily found in the past than in the present. And I also think that in the past, theatre traditions are so much clearer. So in 1912, the actual dramatic texts of Bhasa's 13 plays were discovered in Trivandrum. Does that mean that Bhasa did not exist prior to 1912? Indeed, he existed, not in some primordial memory, but in actual what I will call performance texts. The Attaprakarams and Kramadipikas, the acting and production manuals associated with a centuries-old performance tradition of Kudiyatham and Nangyar Kuttu from Kerala. Now, in these texts, one finds cryptic notations of the basic components of Abhinaya, Rag, Tal, and cues for entrances and exits. So even as Bhasa was not named, his play Swapna Vasvadattam was elaborated on in great detail. Significantly, I don't believe there's any Attaprakaram for Shakuntala. To this day, and that's what I love about my profession, the theatre, that we can say to this day, and we can go back, we can be talking about the 11th century or whatever, and we can say to this day, and it's alive. No actor of Nangyar Kuttu or Kudiyatham would begin a performance before the creation of a fully realized Attaprakaram, which has to be written. In her meticulous research on several Attaprakarams, in which she has searched rigorously for the missing roles of women in the Nangyar Kuttu repertoire, the renowned actress Usha Nangyar, in my view, is as much a historian as she is a performer. Her recent revival, or should I say recreation, of the performance of Mandodari at the Adishakti Ramayana festival, which I curated, could be described as a testament of creating evidence on the basis of existing fragments. Usha used the opening and closing shlokas of an Attaprakaram relating to Mandodari to create her own performance text, in which she filled out the details of the missing Nirvahanam, or flashback sequence, in which the very essence of a performer's skill is tested as she steps backwards in time to create the genealogy of a character from previous births. So my God, it's not just the actor who's a historian, the character is also going through some kind of a historical process, because you've got to retrace your steps, and once again, genealogy is important. Now, I mention these details to emphasize that the dramatic text matters in performance. I love the text, but only to the extent that it triggers a transformative process in the performance. They're not the same things. Nangyar Kuttu is a solo performance tradition. There are many other kinds of performance traditions we have where the task, the functions of speaking the text or singing the text or chanting the text and enacting the text are two totally different functions. So, for example, in the temple-based dance drama tradition of Krishnatam at the Guruvayu temple, the Brahmins and Ambalavasis do sing the Sanskrit text of Krishna Giti composed by Manaveda, and the Nayars dance to that text. But the important thing to remember, the dancer actors do not follow the text. They create their own textuality in performance. They are independent spaces. I'd now like us to think and problematize a bit this whole business about authorization. Who authorizes the writing of history? And I have no other option, I think, but to repeat a story that I've told many times, not least because its lessons have yet to be fully absorbed. The scene is Avataram from Krishnatam. On one end of the performance space in the Guruvayur temple, the child Krishna is presented as an icon, a figurine, standing absolutely still in resplendent silence. On the other end, his mother is beating her breast and forehead, complaining about how naughty he is with some very crude lokadharmi. At some point, the icon begins to deconstruct itself as the child Krishna repeats two real gestures: the grazing of his foot on the ground and a wave of his hand. Now these little gestures of a guilty child are repeated over and over again, acquiring in the process a different temporality and stylization. If you repeat one gesture for about 10 minutes, it's no longer a real gesture. It takes on some other kind of resonance. At some point, to the musical cue provided by the Madhulam and Chenda, the child Krishna prostrates himself before his mother, who picks him up and tucks him around her waist. Now, I remember sharing this experience with my mentor, L.S. Rajagopalan, a very caustic Tamil Brahmin, who brushed aside my description by saying that I had made it up. Only later, when I emphasized very indignantly that the sequence had gone on for at least 45 minutes, did he acknowledge, it doesn't matter. Now clearly what mattered to Rajagopalan, as indeed to most historians of Krishnatam, are the rag and tal, which are specifically written into Manaveda's text of Krishna Giti. The rest of the performance is at best peripheral, not worthy of being recorded in performance history. Now this brings me back to academic history, and to that valuable observation made by Ronajit Guha in his essay, The Small Voice of History. Quote, "Who is it that nominates the deeds and events for history? Which particular events and deeds are regarded as historic while others are not? Who decides, and according to what values and what criteria?" I love this man's clarity. If we had to substitute deeds and events for performances, I think we need to ask ourselves the same questions in relation to the process of nomination and authorization that goes into the writing of theatre and performance history. And indeed, we need to question Ronajit Guha himself, admittedly a Professor Guha writing about Neel Dorpan many years before The Small Voice of History, about his own exclusions in his far too singular reading of Dinabandhu Mitra's dramatic text at the expense of imagining its performance history. Significantly, the one voice, the one small voice of history that Guha mentions in passing without any critical engagement, and who could have contradicted his reading of history, is Binodini's, the actress. In her remarkable diptych of memoirs, in which she rewrites her own observations of Bengali theatre a second time, I find this wonderful. The actress repeats the same kind of narrative in two versions, even by leaving her text incomplete. I do believe we have one of the richest sources of evidence relating to Bengali theatre history. Like Usha Nangyar today, I see in Binodini an actress historian with a thoroughly lived, passionate, and yet critical observation of theatre practice, inevitably complicated by the exigencies of autobiography. From her two versions of the disruption of the Neel Dorpan performance by the Great National Theatre in Lucknow in 1875, this has at best some kind of anecdotal value for most people in the theatre. You know the story, many of you. What happened? Maybe hear it again. We learn how the predominantly European spectators in the audience, who outnumbered the Indians, the Europeans, the British were there in full force, notably red-faced drunken soldiers from the cantonment, rose to their feet in that important scene when a peasant woman is being attacked, indeed raped, by Mr. Rogue, who is then subsequently beaten up by Prof. Swords unsheathed. Some of these soldiers actually had swords, you begin to realize. Some of these soldiers cross the footlights on stage, the backdrop is lowered, the actors flee in terror, and the manager cowers in fear backstage. The district magistrate intervenes, the show is cancelled, the actors are given police custody, their props and costumes left behind only to be picked up the following day. And all of these details, of course, can be dismissed as a mere skirmish. And that's how it's intentionally read. I read terror in this, not a skirmish. No Asuric invasion of colonial demons on the indigenous stage. I'm compelled to ask, if Neil Dorpan had been so emphatically legitimized by 1872, with Indigo no longer providing any political or economic threat to the Raj, then how does one account for a disruption of this particular performance in Lucknow 3 years later? It's stale news. What's the big deal? What's the problem? Everybody knows that it's going to be. It's safe. And this is where I would say the affect created by specific performative circumstances, this location, this stage, this audience, can make all the difference. A production that might seem totally safe can suddenly ignite and take on a different threat. So, how do we historicize the unpredictability of performance? Somewhat too condescendingly, Guho states, quote, the author Dinabandhu Mitra does not allow his realism to get the better of his philosophy. I disagree completely. Let's keep in mind that this is the first play on the Indian stage that has the guts to show a rape or an attempted rape on stage. A realistic representation of rape, however stereotypical and melodramatic in its representation, with all the problems that we know of voyeurism, whatever, rape on stage is a volatile phenomenon. To this day, we know this from any number of people. When people do social realism in rural areas of India to this day, there's an actual kind of impact. People get up from their seats. How many of us would have the guts to represent December 16th realistically? We can resort to many other strategies which could be very worthy, but realism comes with its own dangers and risks. Even while acknowledging that the evidence of Neil Dorpan's actual materiality in performance is hard to assess, it cannot be separated from the larger material conditions of the Bengali theatre, of which there is ample evidence in Binodini's writings. And this is where I want to open up another question. Materiality. What is this materiality of theatre? Yes, at one level it is linked to the materiality of the social world in terms of the means and modes of productions, in terms of capital, and all those things that we talk about. So I think theatre comes with its own materiality, which we don't address. Its own modes of labor. Not unlike its counterparts worldwide in most late 19th century theatre cultures, the Bengali stage is a dangerous space, prone to accidents and fire. Listen to Binodini address the rudimentary technology used in the production of Jyotirindranath Thakur's Shorajini, and I draw here where Rajput women dressed in red saris encircle the pyre singing, the flames of the fire maddening the spectators. I'm drawing on Rimli Bhattacharya's translation of Binodini's writings. Listen to Binodini here, quote, we had no electricity those days. Sheets of tin about 4 or 5 feet long would be spread on the stage, and thin sticks of wood would be laid on them and then set aflame. One by one, the women throw themselves into the flames. The fire would then be fanned by kerosene, squirted from the long nozzles of pitchkaris. The flames would rise and somebody's hair would be burned. Some other's clothes would catch fire, but no one cared. Indeed, in one such performance, Binodini's hair and costume did catch on fire. She could have been burned alive. But this fire was stamped out by her co-actor, Upendra Mitra Mahashoy. Binodini ends this passage with remarkable candor. She says, "There was in those days a special bond of love and affection among the theatre people. They regarded each other as the closest of relations." Attiyo Shambondhosh Tapon. This is the neologism used by Rabindranath Tagore to evoke the intimacies that exist in the construct of Samaj in his pivotal essay Swadeshi Samaj, which I deal with in Another Asia. What indeed is the Samaj of theatre? This question compels us to acknowledge that the intimacies of theatre constitute a specific sociality that cannot be simply subsumed within mainstream notions of Samaj in political theory, still less civil society. Here, it's not adequate to simply spell out the social relationships of actors, actresses, managers, mistresses, and rich patrons, cutting across class, community, and caste. This is important. I'm not trying to undermine it. But more specifically, one needs to find a language to evoke the intimacies between actors in performance, a phenomenology of intimacies, as it were, catalyzed through touch, smell, eye contact, cover-ups, substitutions, and subterfuge, all of them constituting the dangerous liaisons of performance, as much on the stage as off. So as I come to the end of this lecture, it's only appropriate that I end with Ronajit Guho, who has been a kind of leitmotif in this entire talk, in a sense, the person who is interlocuting, to whom I'm drawing on. And I'm going to turn to one of his very last and most remarkable books, which I wish I could deal with at length, History at the Limit of World History, which in some ways has sparked the argumentative tenor of this lecture, even though it is not world history that concerns me so much as the unwritten histories of theatre and performance in India. In the scrupulously reflexive auto-critique, as he describes it, although Guho does not specifically mention the spent force of subaltern, whose penultimate writing, Shahitye Oitihashikota, is translated by Guho as historicality in literature. Tagore's brief text is particularly resonant in the context of this lecture, not least because it hovers between orality and the written word in several different registers and versions. Tagore was too old to write his own text. It was towards the end of his life. So he dictated it to Buddhadev Basu, whose own version of the oral transcript went through several drafts, which ultimately got published in 2 journals in very different versions. And through this circuitous and intricate process, it should be kept in mind that the poet was ridden with anxiety, almost driven by a fear that he was bound to be misunderstood. And once again, I return to fear, the fear of history, a different fear from that of Komaldar. Komaldar's fear of history perhaps is linked to the fact that he can't deal with dates and facts, he doesn't quite know how to write this history. That's not Tagore's problem. He's the supreme writer. Maybe his fear is linked to a kind of ideological pressure that's coming from certain quarters that branded him as bourgeois. So instead of elaborating on this anxiety, Guho does the opposite. He upholds Tagore's text as providing a ground, as it were, for the positing of a new, more imagined history on the borders of literature. Avoiding any attempt to read against the poetic grain of Tagore's text, he invokes the poet's construction of the history of that day, Shedinkal Itihash. What is the history of that day of Neel Dorpun in Lucknow in 1875? Can we create that moment, that history of that day? Well, for Tagore, his history of that day returns to childhood memories. That's the source. The dew glistening on the top of a coconut grove at dawn, dark clouds amassed around his ancestral home, a cow licking the back of a foal. in the history of that day, there was no one other than myself, as Tagore asserts, who saw those clouds in quite the same way as I did. Now, instead of interpreting this arguably ultra-subjective affirmation of the creative self in the context of epiphany or poetic illumination, Guho assumes somewhat too quickly that this is the kind of history to which historians need to aspire. But how? In the process, it could be argued that he misreads Tagore, as Rosinka Chowdhury has elaborated in a painstaking reading of Tagore's essay and its messy publishing history, vis-a-vis what she describes as subalternist misinterpretations. To my mind, there is nothing subalternist about Guho's misinterpretation. It's post-subalternist, if anything. And I would agree with Chowdhury that the poet is not attempting to write another history. For God's sake, he's got other things to do with his life. He's saying to hell with history. All he's pleading for is the freedom for creativity not to be subsumed by historiographical strictures and the demands of materialist realism. Misinterpretations, misunderstandings, and misreadings, however problematic for the discipline of academic history, I would argue, can spark new paradigms of critical thinking. So instead of faulting Ronajit Guho for envisioning something like a poet's history on the lines of the poet's religion, I would argue that we too need to push the limits of existing historiographies of theatre and performance, which are increasingly circumscribed by the discourses of social scientists instrumentalizing pragmatic facts of theatre history in the interest of a larger social history on colonialism and the empire. Divested of the multiple dynamics of relationality or intimacy that animate the life of the theatre, and far too embedded in positivist and literal readings of dramatic texts and social documents, without acknowledging that performance has the capacity to subvert and betray the most rigorous of texts, this history of theatre instrumentalized in the social sciences is at best a critical point of reference. More productively, I would say it can serve as a point of departure for us to create our own histories in which the materiality of theatre can be reimagined through a new search for evidence that is created both within the ephemeral existence of performance on stage and its multiple afterlives beyond the stage in the practices, memories, and fantasies of everyday life. Thank you.